Are you crying, Mama?
Fetch more wine, servant. And do try not to embarrass my son with your clumsiness this time. Those words, spoken in front of 300 wedding guests, by my own mother-in-law, Thyra Andersdatter, the woman who had promised to love me as her own daughter when I married her son, Henrik, 7 years ago. But that promise died the same night my husband did, leaving me with nothing but a fading memory and a child she refused to acknowledge. I stood there in that grand hall, my hands trembling as I held the empty wine pitcher, feeling every eye in the room turn toward me. The silk dress I'd saved for months to buy suddenly felt like rags against my skin. My cheeks burned with a humiliation so deep I thought I might shatter right there on the polished stone floor. But before I tell you what happened next, before I share how one moment changed everything and put that cruel woman in her place forever, I need you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button right now. Because what happens in the next few minutes of this story will restore your faith that dignity always finds its way back to those who deserve it. And tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from? I want to send you a hug because I know some of you have felt this same crushing weight of being treated as less than you are. Now let me take you back to where this all began. My name is Astrid Jensdatter, and I was born in a small village on the outskirts of Copenhagen 29 years ago. My father, Jens, was a skilled carpenter, and my mother, Bert, took in washing and mending to help make ends meet. We were not wealthy, but we were respectable. We were proud. My father built the finest chairs and tables in 3 villages, and my mother's needlework was so exquisite that even the merchant wives sought her out. I was 17 when I first saw Henrik Thyrason at the summer festival. He was 23, tall and broad-shouldered, with kind blue eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. His family owned significant farmland and had connections to the shipping trade. They were what we called comfortable. Not nobility but certainly well above our station. I never imagined he would notice me. I was just a carpenter's daughter in a simple dress, dancing with the other village girls. But he did notice. He asked me to dance 3 times that night, and by the 3rd dance I was already half in love with him. "You have the most honest face I've ever seen," he told me, his voice soft beneath the sound of the fiddles. "Like you couldn't tell a lie even if you wanted to." He courted me properly for a year. My parents were cautious. His mother, Thyra, made it clear from the beginning that she had hoped Henrik would marry Else Mortensen, the daughter of a wealthy grain merchant. Else was educated, polished, and came with a substantial dowry. I came with calloused hands and a hope chest my mother and I had filled with linens we'd sewn ourselves. But Henrik loved me. He told his mother that he would marry me or no one, and eventually she relented. Or so I thought. The wedding was smaller than Thyra had wanted. She made sure everyone knew that. She seated my parents at the far end of the hall, away from the honored guests. She introduced me to her friends as Henrik's choice, with just enough emphasis on the word to make it clear it hadn't been hers. But I was young and in love, and Henrik's hand in mine made everything else fade away. We moved into a small house on the edge of his family's property, not the main house where Thyra lived, but close enough that she could keep watch over us, over me. The first year was beautiful despite her constant interference. Henrik worked with his uncle in the shipping offices, keeping ledgers and managing contracts. I kept our home, tended a small garden, and tried my best to win Thyra's approval. I brought her fresh bread every Sunday. I asked for her advice on preserving fruits and smoking meat. I complimented her taste, her wisdom, her son. Nothing was ever enough. "Astrid dear, you've swept the floor in the wrong direction. Everyone knows you must sweep toward the door to sweep bad fortune out of the house. Astrid, those carrots are cut far too thick. Did your mother teach you nothing about cooking? Astrid, you really should wear your hair up more often. Loose hair is for young girls, and you're a married woman now." Henrik would defend me at first, but after enough arguments with his mother, even he began to gently suggest that maybe I should try things her way, just to keep the peace. I learned to bite my tongue. I learned to nod and smile and say, "Yes, of course, you're absolutely right." Then, in our second year of marriage, I became pregnant. For a few precious months, Thyra actually softened toward me. She brought me special teas for morning sickness. She gave me one of her own baby blankets, hand-knitted and carefully preserved. She told me stories about when Henrik was born, and I saw a tenderness in her I'd never witnessed before. "A grandson," she would say, her hand on my growing belly. "I can feel it. You're carrying a son, Astrid. A son to carry on our family name." I gave birth to Magnus on a cold February morning. He was perfect, tiny fists, a head of dark hair, lungs that announced his arrival to the entire household. Henrik wept when he held him. My parents came and stood at the bedside, my father's eyes wet with pride, my mother stroking my hair like I was still her little girl. Thyra came too. She took Magnus from Henrik's arms and examined him with the scrutiny of someone evaluating livestock. Then she looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "He has the Thyrason forehead," she announced. "And Henrik's nose. At least the boy looks like his father's family." It was a small cruelty, barely noticeable to anyone who wasn't listening carefully. But I heard it. "You look like an outsider, but thank goodness your son looks like us." Life with a new baby was exhausting and wonderful. Magnus was a good child, quick to smile, curious about everything. Henrik was a devoted father, coming home each evening eager to hold his son and hear about every small milestone. The first time Magnus grabbed his own toes, the way he would laugh at the cat, how he loved being sung to. We were happy. So perfectly, preciously happy. And then, one rainy October evening when Magnus was just 18 months old, Henrik didn't come home. There had been an accident at the docks. A crane loading cargo onto a ship had malfunctioned, and a massive crate had fallen. Henrik had been standing in the wrong place at the wrong moment. They told me he died instantly, that he didn't suffer. I remember very little of the days immediately after. I remember the sound of my own screaming. I remember my mother holding me while I collapsed. I remember Magnus crying because he could sense something was terribly wrong, and I couldn't even pick him up because my arms had stopped working. The funeral was a blur of black cloth and pitying faces and the sound of dirt hitting a coffin. And then the real nightmare began. 3 weeks after we buried Henrik, Thyra came to my house. The house where Henrik and I had built our life together, where Magnus had taken his first steps, where we had been happy. She didn't knock. She simply walked in with her brother, Sven, and a man I didn't recognize who carried a leather case full of papers. "Astrid," she said, her voice clipped and businesslike. "We need to discuss your situation." My situation. As if my husband's death was merely a logistical inconvenience. "This house," she continued, settling herself in the chair by the fire like she owned it, which it turned out she did. "This house belongs to the family property. Now that my son is gone, there's no reason for you to continue living here." I stared at her, not understanding. "This is my home. Magnus' home. This is my property," she corrected, "which I generously allowed Henrik to use." "But you are not Henrik." She gestured to the man with the papers. "Lars here is the family solicitor. He'll explain the legalities, but the simple truth is this. You have no claim to this house, to the family business, or to any of the Thyrason holdings. Henrik's share reverts to me." "But, Magnus," I managed to say. "Surely Magnus." "Magnus is a baby," Thyra interrupted. "And while he is my grandson, he is also half you. The business and properties require proper management, not the fumbling hands of a carpenter's daughter who can barely manage her own household accounts." The words hit me like physical blows. I looked to Sven, hoping for some intervention, some mercy. But he stood silently by the door, his face carefully neutral. He'd always been kind to me before, but now, with Henrik gone, I was apparently not worth defending. "What are you saying?" I asked, though I already knew. I could feel the ground crumbling beneath my feet. "I'm saying you'll need to make other arrangements," Thyra replied. "You're young. You'll remarry eventually. In the meantime, I suggest you return to your parents' home." I'll give you 1 month to vacate the premises. 1 month. Where am I supposed to go with a baby? My parents live in a single room now. My father's joints hurt too badly for carpentry work, and they've had to take a smaller place. There's no room for. That is hardly my concern, Thyra said, standing up. You've had security and comfort through your marriage to my son. But that chapter is closed now, Astrid. It's time you faced reality. I should have fought harder in that moment. I should have refused to leave, should have consulted my own solicitor, should have screamed and raged and demanded my rights. But I was drowning in grief, exhausted from caring for a toddler alone, and completely unprepared for such calculated cruelty from a woman I'd tried so hard to please. So I left. I packed what belongings I could carry, wrapped Magnus in his warmest blanket, and moved into the tiny room my parents had. My father tried to hide how much pain he was in. My mother stretched every coin to feed 4 mouths instead of 2. And I took work wherever I could find it, washing, mending, helping at the baker's before dawn. Magnus grew despite our poverty. He was bright and sweet and looked so much like Henrik that sometimes it physically hurt to look at him. I told him stories about his father every night. I made sure he knew he came from love, even if we had nothing else. Thyra didn't visit. Not once in 6 years. Then last spring everything changed again. Sven, Thyra's brother, had never married and had no children of his own. He'd managed the family's shipping interests for decades, and everyone assumed the business would eventually pass to some distant cousin. But Sven had other ideas. He came to find me on a Tuesday afternoon. I was hanging washing in the small courtyard behind my parents' building when I saw him approaching, better dressed than anyone in our neighborhood, looking uncomfortable and out of place. Astrid, he said, removing his hat. I need to speak with you about Magnus. My heart dropped. What about Magnus? Is something wrong? No, nothing wrong, he assured me quickly. Quite the opposite. I want to acknowledge him as my heir. I blinked at him, certain I'd misheard. Your heir? I'm 63 years old, Sven said. I've never had children and I never will. The shipping business needs someone to carry it forward. Someone with Thyrasan blood. Magnus is Henrik's son. My great-nephew. It should go to him. But Thyra. My sister doesn't control my decisions, Sven said firmly. She had her chance to do right by Henrik's son, and she chose cruelty instead. I won't make the same mistake. Magnus is 7 now, yes. Yes, I whispered, my mind racing. Old enough to begin learning. I want to train him, Astrid. I want to teach him the business, give him a proper education, and when I die, I want him to inherit everything I own. But I need your permission. You're his mother. I almost collapsed right there among the wet sheets. Of course, I said, tears streaming down my face. Of course, yes. Thank you. Thank you. There's one condition, Sven added gently. For the business community to accept him, he needs to be publicly acknowledged. We're hosting a celebration next month. My nephew Lars is getting married. It's going to be a large affair, all the important families and business associates. I want to announce Magnus as my heir there before everyone. Make it official and binding. Lars? Yes. The solicitor. Thyra's nephew. The same. It's complicated family, I know. Sven smiled slightly. Lars is actually a good man. He felt terrible about how Thyra treated you, but he was bound by law and family obligation. His bride is Karna, the daughter of a shipping magnate from Aarhus. It's an important match, and everyone who matters will be there. Including Thyra, I said quietly. Including Thyra, Sven confirmed. Which is why this is the perfect moment. She can't make a scene in front of all those people, and once the announcement is made publicly, there's nothing she can do to change it. Magnus' future will be secured. So I agreed. Sven began visiting regularly, bringing Magnus books and spending hours teaching him about ships and trade routes and how to calculate profit margins. Magnus adored him. For the first time since Henrik died, my son had a father figure, someone who believed in him. Sven also insisted on buying us proper clothes for the wedding. "You're the mother of my heir," he said when I protested. "You'll dress accordingly." The silk dress arrived a week before the wedding. Deep blue, beautifully tailored, with silver embroidery at the collar and cuffs. I'd never owned anything so fine. Magnus had a new suit as well, and looked so handsome and grown up that I wept when I saw him dressed. "Why are you crying, Mama?" he asked, concerned. "Because you look just like your father," I told him. "And because I'm so proud of you I could burst." The day of the wedding arrived. Sven had arranged for a carriage to collect us, another small detail that felt extraordinary after years of walking everywhere. Magnus pressed his face to the window, watching Copenhagen roll past, pointing out ships in the harbor. The wedding was being held at one of the grand halls near Nyhavn, the kind of place I'd only ever seen from the outside. Inside, it was all soaring ceilings and polished wood and candlelight that made everything glow. There were flowers everywhere, great cascading arrangements of roses and lilies that must have cost more than I earned in a month. And there were people, so many people, merchants and ship owners and their elegantly dressed wives. I recognized some faces from years ago, back when I'd been Henrik's wife and had attended a few functions. Some nodded politely. Others looked through me as if I were invisible. Then I saw her. Thyra stood near the center of the hall, holding court among a cluster of well-dressed women. She wore burgundy silk and enough jewelry to sink a small boat. Her hair was elaborately arranged, silver now but still thick. She was laughing at something one of the women had said. Her face animated and warm in a way I'd rarely seen directed at me. She hadn't noticed me yet. Sven had positioned us near the entrance, waiting for the right moment to move through the crowd. Magnus held my hand tightly, overwhelmed by the noise and the number of strangers. "It's all right," I whispered to him. "Uncle Sven will be here soon." "There are so many people, Mama," he whispered back. "What if I say something wrong?" "You won't," I assured him. "Just be yourself. That's all anyone can ask." But my own stomach was churning with anxiety. I hadn't seen Thyra in 6 years. I had no idea how she would react to our presence, to Sven's plan. I knew he'd written to her about it, but whether she'd believed him or thought she could still change his mind I couldn't say. The ceremony began, and we took our seats in the middle section. Not the front rows reserved for family, but not the back either. Another calculated positioning by Sven. Present but not presumptuous. The wedding itself was beautiful. Lars looked nervous but happy, and his bride Karna was lovely, with warm eyes and a genuine smile. They said their vows, were blessed by the minister, and then everyone moved into the even larger adjacent hall where the feast was laid out. Long tables groaned under the weight of food, roasted meats, fish prepared 6 different ways, breads and cheeses and pastries. There was wine and ale flowing freely. Musicians played in the corner. It was the kind of celebration that would be talked about for months. Sven found us quickly. "Stay close," he murmured to me. "After the first toast, I'm going to make the announcement. Be ready." My heart hammered in my chest. Magnus looked up at me with his father's blue eyes, trusting and excited. I squeezed his hand. But before Sven could move toward the head table, Thyra spotted us. I watched her face change. First confusion. Who were these well-dressed people near her brother? Then recognition, and her expression hardened into something cold and sharp. She excused herself from her conversation and walked straight toward us, her silk skirts rustling with each step. "Astrid," she said, my name like ice in her mouth. "What are you doing here?" "She's here as my guest," Sven said firmly, appearing at my elbow. "As is Magnus." Thyra's eyes flicked to Magnus, and I saw something complicated cross her face. She hadn't seen her grandson in 6 years. He'd been a toddler when she'd thrown us out. Now he was a boy, clearly Henrik's son, with the same straight nose and determined chin. "Your guest," Thyra repeated slowly. "How interesting." "We'll talk later, Thyra," Sven said, his tone brooking no argument. "This is Lars's day. Let's not make a scene." For a moment I thought she would argue. But we were surrounded by guests, and Thyra had always been conscious of appearances. She gave me one more cold look and returned to her circle of friends. That went better than expected, Sven muttered. Come. The announcement will happen soon, and I want you near the front. He guided us through the crowd, Magnus' hand still firmly in mine. People were beginning to settle at the tables, finding their assigned seats. I realized with a jolt that Sven was leading us to the family table, the one at the front of the hall where the bride and groom sat with their closest relatives. Sven, I whispered urgently. We can't sit there. That's family. You are family, he said simply. You're Henrik's widow and Magnus' mother. You belong here. But there were only so many seats, and I could see that Thyra had already positioned herself at the family table, next to what appeared to be reserved seats for other relatives. There was nowhere for us to sit without displacing someone. Perhaps we should, I began, but Sven was already speaking to one of the servants, who quickly brought 2 additional chairs and squeezed them in at the end of the family table. Thyra noticed immediately. I watched her lean over and say something sharp to Sven, but he ignored her, settling Magnus in the seat next to his and gesturing for me to take the one beside Magnus. The musicians finished their song, and the room gradually quieted. Lars stood, raising his glass, his new wife beside him glowing with happiness. Thank you all for being here today, Lars said, his voice carrying across the hall. Karna and I are overwhelmed by your generosity and your presence at our celebration. To have so many friends and family gathered together, it means more than we can express. There was warm applause. Karna said a few words as well, thanking her parents and Lars's family. Then she smiled at Thyra specifically. And special thanks to Aunt Thyra, who has been so welcoming and helped plan this beautiful day. More applause. Thyra inclined her head graciously, playing the role of generous matriarch perfectly. Then Sven stood up. The room quieted again, people turning their attention to him with interest. Sven was well known in the shipping community, respected for his business acumen. When he spoke, people listened. Before we begin the feast, Sven said, his voice strong and clear, I have an announcement to make. As many of you know, I've never married, never had children of my own. But I have been blessed to be part of a large family, and I've had the privilege of watching my nephews and great-nephews grow. I felt Magnus tense beside me, sensing something important was about to happen. 7 years ago, we lost my nephew Henrik Thyrason in a tragic accident, Sven continued, and I saw several heads nod sympathetically. People remembered. Henrik left behind a young son, Magnus, who carries not only his father's name but his father's character. I've spent the past several months getting to know this boy, teaching him about our family's business, and I've been profoundly impressed by his intelligence, his work ethic, and his integrity. The room was completely silent now. Everyone was listening. I could feel Thyra's fury radiating from across the table, but she couldn't move, couldn't speak, not without causing the exact scene she'd warned Sven against. Therefore, Sven said, and now he placed his hand on Magnus' shoulder, I am proud to publicly acknowledge Magnus Henriksson as my chosen heir. He will inherit my share of the family shipping business and all my properties. I've had the papers drawn up and signed. It is legal and binding. Magnus is my successor. The room erupted. Some people applauded immediately, moved by the gesture. Others began whispering to their neighbors, processing this news and what it meant for the family's business dealings. Several of the older merchants stood to offer their congratulations, coming forward to shake Sven's hand and greet Magnus. Magnus looked up at me, his eyes wide with shock and something like fear. This was so much attention, so many important people suddenly interested in him. It's all right, I whispered, my own eyes wet with tears. You deserve this. Your father would be so proud. But before I could say anything more, I felt someone grip my arm hard enough to hurt. Thyra had moved around the table. Her face was a mask of barely controlled rage, but her voice was low, meant only for me. You conniving little witch, she hissed. You put him up to this. You manipulated my brother. I did nothing of the sort, I said, pulling my arm free. Sven came to me. This was his choice. His choice, she spat. You think I don't know how women like you work? You've been plotting this for years, waiting for your opportunity to sink your claws back into this family's money. That's enough, Thyra. Sven's voice cut through her tirade like a blade. He had turned from the well-wishers and was looking at his sister with an expression I'd never seen before, disappointment mixed with steel. This is not the time or place, he said quietly. You will comport yourself with dignity, or you will leave. Leave! Thyra's voice rose, drawing attention from nearby guests. This is my family. Then act like it, Sven said sharply. Magnus is Henrik's son. Your grandson. And you threw him out into poverty when he was barely more than a baby because you couldn't get past your pride and your petty cruelty toward his mother. Several people had stopped talking now, openly watching the confrontation. Thyra seemed to realize she was losing control of the narrative. She took a breath, visibly composing herself. We'll discuss this later, she said tightly. Privately. There's nothing to discuss, Sven replied. The decision is made and announced. But you're right about one thing. This is neither the time nor place for family drama. So I suggest you return to your seat and let Lars and Karna enjoy their celebration. For a long moment, Thyra just stared at him. Then she looked at me, and the hatred in her eyes was so intense I almost stepped back. But I held my ground, refusing to be cowed. Not anymore. Not after everything. She turned on her heel and walked away, not back to her seat at the family table but toward the door, her spine rigid with fury. Several people murmured as she passed, and I knew this would be the gossip of Copenhagen for weeks. Thyra Andersdatter leaving her own nephew's wedding in a rage. But I didn't care. For the first time in 6 years, I didn't care what Thyra thought or what she said about me. Magnus was safe. His future was secure. That was all that mattered. The feast proceeded, though with an undercurrent of excited whispers about what had just transpired. Magnus received congratulations from dozens of people, and I watched him slowly grow more comfortable, shaking hands and thanking people with surprising grace. Sven stayed close to us throughout the evening, introducing Magnus to important contacts, explaining who was who in the shipping world. Lars and Karna came over at one point, and Lars actually apologized to me. I felt terrible about that day for 6 years, he said quietly. I had to follow the law and Thyra's instructions, but it never sat right with me. I'm glad Uncle Sven is correcting that wrong. Thank you, I said, touched by his sincerity. And congratulations on your marriage. Your bride seems wonderful. She is, Lars said, smiling at Karna. She's already told me she wants to meet Magnus properly. Learn about the shipping business. She says any family that could produce someone as principled as Uncle Sven must have good people in it. It was a generous thing to say, and I felt some of the tight knot of anxiety in my chest finally begin to loosen. But the evening wasn't over yet. As the feast wound down and people began to settle in for the dancing and drinking that would last into the night, I excused myself to find the washroom. Magnus was safe with Sven, who was introducing him to a ship captain who worked on their North Sea routes. I made my way through the crowded hall and down a corridor toward the back of the building where the facilities were located. I was just about to open the door when I heard voices, angry, hushed voices, coming from a small side room. Absolutely humiliated me. In front of everyone. Thyra. I froze, my hand on the door handle. You humiliated yourself, Thyra. Another woman's voice, older and tart. I've known you for 40 years, and I've never been more ashamed to call you friend. Don't you dare judge me, Thyra snapped. You don't understand. I understand perfectly, the other woman interrupted. That girl married your son. She gave you a grandson. And when Henrik died, instead of helping her, instead of treating her like the daughter you'd promised to accept, you threw her out like trash. And for what? Pride. Pettiness. The fact that she wasn't from the right family. She was never good enough for Henrik. Henrik loved her. Anyone with eyes could see it. And that boy out there, the one Sven just made his heir. That's Henrik's child, Thyra. Your flesh and blood. And you turned your back on him because you couldn't get over yourself. There was a long silence. Then Thyra's voice, smaller than I'd ever heard it. What would you have me do? Apologize. Beg for forgiveness after 6 years. That would be a start, the other woman said dryly. Though I suspect that girl deserves more than just an apology. She deserves your respect. But you're so busy protecting your pride that you can't see you've already lost everything that matters. Sven has cut you out. Lars clearly thinks you were wrong. And now everyone at this wedding knows exactly what kind of person you are. I heard movement. Someone standing, preparing to leave the room. I quickly moved away from the door, not wanting to be caught eavesdropping, and slipped into the washroom. My hands were shaking as I splashed water on my face. Part of me felt vindicated. Someone had finally said to Thyra what needed to be said. But another part of me just felt tired. Tired of the conflict, tired of the anger, tired of carrying around 6 years of hurt and humiliation. I just wanted to move forward. For Magnus' sake, if nothing else. When I emerged from the washroom, Thyra was standing in the corridor. She'd been waiting for me. We stared at each other for a long moment, and I braced myself for another attack, another round of vitriol and blame. But instead she just looked tired and old. For the first time I saw her as she really was. A woman in her 60s who had lost her son and then pushed away everyone else because she didn't know how else to deal with her grief and her fear of losing control. I heard you, I said quietly. Your conversation with your friend. Thyra's jaw tightened, but she didn't deny it. Then you know what she thinks of me. What everyone thinks of me now. I know what you did to us, I replied. To Magnus. He's 7 years old, and he's never known his grandmother. He's never had that. He doesn't need me, Thyra said, but there was no conviction in it. Maybe not, I agreed. But that doesn't mean it wouldn't be good for him to have you in his life. If you could actually be kind. If you could put aside your pride and your anger and just see him. See that he's a good boy who deserves better than what you've given him. Thyra looked away, her hands clenching and unclenching at her sides. I don't know how to fix this, she said finally, so quietly I almost didn't hear her. You start by trying, I said. That's all. Just try. I didn't wait for her response. I walked past her, back toward the hall where my son was waiting, where his future was bright and secure despite everything his grandmother had done to prevent it. But as I reached the doorway, I heard her voice one more time. Astrid. Turned back. Thyra was still standing in the corridor, silhouetted against the candlelight. Her shoulders were hunched, her face shadowed. I'm sorry, she said. For what I said earlier. For calling you. For treating you like you were beneath us. You never deserved that. It wasn't a full apology. It didn't erase 6 years of hardship and struggle and nights when I'd cried myself to sleep wondering how I would feed my son. But it was a start. Crack in the armor. Thank you, I said simply and meant it. I returned to the hall and found Magnus exactly where I'd left him, now sitting with Sven and several of the older merchants, listening intently as they discussed trade routes to the Baltic. He looked up when he saw me and smiled, that open, trusting smile that was pure Henrik. Mama. Captain Olsen says there are ports all the way north in Norway where the sun doesn't set in summer. Is that true? It is, I confirmed, ruffling his hair. Your uncle Sven will teach you all about it. I will indeed, Sven said warmly. He glanced past me toward the corridor and raised an eyebrow. Everything all right? Yes, I said and realized I meant it. Everything is fine. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of music and conversation. Magnus fell asleep against my shoulder around midnight, exhausted from the excitement and attention. Sven arranged for a carriage to take us home, and this time home meant a new place. A small but comfortable house Sven owned on a better street, which he insisted we move into immediately. Your family, he'd said when I protested. And the mother of my heir needs a proper home. This is not charity, Astrid. This is what's right. The next morning, I woke in a real bed in a house with multiple rooms and windows that let in morning light. Magnus was still sleeping, sprawled across his own bed in his own room with his new books stacked on a shelf Sven had already installed. I stood at the window, looking out over Copenhagen, and thought about everything that had changed. How one woman's cruelty had almost destroyed us, and how one man's integrity had saved us. How the worst moment of my life at that wedding, being called a servant in front of everyone, had actually been the catalyst for everything that followed. Because in the days after the wedding, more changed than just our living situation. Word spread quickly through Copenhagen's merchant community about Sven's announcement and Thyra's reaction. The story took on a life of its own. Some versions painted me as a scheming woman who had manipulated Sven, not true. Others cast Thyra as a monster, closer to true but still incomplete, and still others focused on Sven's principled stand for justice and family loyalty. What mattered most was that Magnus' position was secured. No one questioned Sven's decision. If anything, it raised both Sven's and Magnus' standing in the community. People respected the gesture, taking in a dead nephew's child, ensuring the family line continued, choosing character over convenience. Thyra, on the other hand, found herself suddenly on the outside of conversations. Her friends were polite but distant. Invitations to social gatherings became less frequent. People remembered how she'd treated her grandson, and they judged her for it. Took 3 weeks before she came to see us. I was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when I heard the knock. Magnus had already left with Sven for the shipping offices. Part of his education now involved spending mornings learning the practical side of the business. I wiped my hands on my apron and opened the door. Thyra stood on my doorstep, dressed more simply than I'd ever seen her. No jewelry, no elaborate hair arrangement. Just a plain gray dress and a shawl against the autumn chill. We stared at each other for a long moment. "May I come in?" she asked finally. I stepped aside and let her enter. She looked around the small house with an expression I couldn't quite read. Surprise, perhaps, at how modest it still was despite Sven's support. Or maybe approval that I hadn't overreached. "Would you like tea?" I offered, defaulting to the hospitality my mother had drilled into me. "Yes, thank you." We sat at my kitchen table, two women who had once been family, separated by years of hurt and pride. I poured the tea and waited. This was her visit. She would have to be the one to speak first. "Magnus looks well," she said finally. "At the wedding. He looked healthy and happy." "He is happy," I confirmed. "Your brother has been extraordinarily kind to him. To both of us." Thyra flinched slightly at that. Sven always had a clearer sense of right and wrong than I did. Even when we were children, he was the one who would stop fights, who would make sure everyone was treated fairly. She paused, her hands wrapped around the teacup. I envied that about him sometimes. His certainty. His ability to just do the right thing without second-guessing himself. I didn't respond. I wasn't going to make this easier for her. "I was wrong," Thyra said abruptly, looking directly at me for the first time. "About you. About Magnus. About everything I did after Henrik died. I was grieving and I was angry and I took it out on the two people who loved him most. That was unforgivable." "Yes," I said quietly. "It was." She didn't flinch from that either. I told myself I was protecting the family interests. That a carpenter's daughter couldn't possibly understand our world, our responsibilities. But the truth was simpler and uglier than that. I never wanted Henrik to marry you because it meant I wasn't in control of his life anymore. And when he died, I punished you for still being alive when my son wasn't. The honesty of it knocked the breath out of me. I had expected excuses, justifications, the same old arguments about my inadequacy. Not this raw admission. "I don't know if you can forgive me," Thyra continued. "I'm not sure I deserve forgiveness. But I wanted you to know that I see now what I did. The harm I caused. The years Magnus could have had a grandmother, and I robbed him of that because I was too proud and too bitter to see past my own grief. Tears were streaming down her face now, and she made no attempt to hide them. This proud woman who had always been so composed, so in control, was falling apart in my kitchen. Why now? Yes. Why come to me now, after 3 weeks of silence? Because I've been sitting in my house alone, thinking about what that friend said to me at the wedding. That I'd lost everything that mattered. And she was right, Astrid. Sven barely speaks to me. Lars is polite but distant. My friends have all heard the story, and they're judging me, justly judging me, for what I did. And my grandson, my Henrik's son, doesn't even know me. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I'm 62 years old. I've spent 6 years nursing my pride and my resentment, and what has it gotten me? Nothing. An empty house and a reputation as a cruel woman. Meanwhile, you raised a beautiful, intelligent boy on your own, with no help from me, and managed to instill in him all the best qualities his father had. I did what any mother would do, I said simply. I loved him. I protected him. I made sure he knew where he came from and who his father was. Did you tell him about me? I considered lying. But what would be the point? I told him he had a grandmother. I told him that sometimes grief makes people do things they regret. I told him that maybe someday things would be different. You were kinder to me in absentia than I ever was to you in person, Thyra said with a bitter laugh. That's damning. I didn't do it for you, I said honestly. I did it for Magnus. I didn't want him to grow up carrying hatred. He has enough to deal with, losing his father so young. Thyra nodded slowly. Would you consider letting me meet him properly? Not at some public function, but here, quietly. Let me get to know my grandson. Let me try to be the grandmother I should have been from the beginning. I wanted to say no. Part of me wanted to turn her away. Let her feel even a fraction of the rejection she'd made me feel for 6 years. But I looked at this woman sitting at my table, genuinely broken, genuinely remorseful, and I thought about Magnus. He deserved to know his grandmother. Not the cruel, prideful version she'd been, but the woman she seemed to be trying to become. And maybe, just maybe, everyone deserved a chance at redemption. He comes home for lunch, I said. You can meet him then. But Thyra, if you hurt him, if you say one cruel word or make him feel less than he is, you will never get another chance. Do you understand? I understand, she said quickly. I swear to you, Astrid, I will never hurt that boy. I'll make mistakes, probably. I'm not used to children. But I will try. I will really, truly try. So she stayed. We sat in awkward silence for a while, then gradually began to talk about safer things. The weather, the upcoming winter, changes in the neighborhood. It wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't hostile either. It was a beginning. When Magnus came home at noon, he stopped short in the doorway, seeing a strange woman sitting at our table. Magnus, I said gently, standing up. This is your grandmother. Your father's mother. She's come to meet you. Magnus looked at Thyra with those serious blue eyes, assessing her with the careful judgment of a child who has learned that not all adults are trustworthy. Hello, he said politely but cautiously. Thyra's face did something complicated, joy and grief and regret all mixing together. Hello, Magnus, she said, her voice thick with emotion. You look so much like your father. So very much like him. Mama says I have his nose, Magnus said, touching his face self-consciously. You do. And his eyes. And I suspect his kind heart. Thyra glanced at me. Your mother has done a remarkable job raising you. Your Uncle Sven tells me you're very clever with numbers and that you ask excellent questions about the shipping routes. Magnus brightened at that, pride overcoming his wariness. Uncle Sven is teaching me everything. Did you know that ships coming from the East Indies can take 6 months for the journey? And they have to watch for pirates and storms and... He launched into an enthusiastic explanation of everything he'd learned that morning, and I watched Thyra's face transform as she listened to him. She was seeing not just Henrik's son, but a person in his own right. a bright, curious boy who loved learning and had dreams of adventure. That first lunch was tentative but not terrible. Thyra didn't stay long, seeming to understand that pushing too hard too fast would backfire. But before she left, she asked if she could visit again. "Perhaps next week," she suggested. "I could bring some things that belonged to your father when he was a boy. Would you like to see them, Magnus?" Magnus looked at me for permission, and I nodded. "Yes, please," he said. "Mama tells me stories about Papa, but I don't have very many things that were his." "Then I'll bring everything I have," Thyra promised. "Stories and things. Your father was an extraordinary person, Magnus. You should know all about him." After she left, Magnus turned to me with a confused expression. "Is she really my grandmother? The one who didn't want us before?" I had never explicitly told Magnus what Thyra had done, but children are perceptive. He'd pieced together enough from overheard conversations and careful omissions to understand that his grandmother existed but had chosen not to be part of our lives. "Yes," I said honestly. "She made some very bad choices after your father died. She was grieving and angry and she took it out on us. But people can change, Magnus. People can realize they were wrong and try to do better." "Do you think she will?" he asked. "Do better, I mean." "I don't know," I admitted. "But I think she wants to try. And I think we should give her the chance to prove it." Magnus thought about this for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Papa would have wanted her to be my grandmother, I think. Mama says Papa loved his mother, even when they disagreed about things." "He did," I confirmed. "Very much." Over the following weeks and months, Thyra became a regular presence in our lives. She was true to her word. She brought boxes of Henrik's childhood belongings, books he'd loved, drawings he'd made, even a wooden ship he'd carved when he was about Magnus' age. She told stories about Henrik's childhood, about his sense of humor and his stubborn streak, and the time he tried to run away to become a sailor at age 10. Magnus soaked it all up like a sponge, desperate for these connections to the father he barely remembered. And watching them together, I saw Thyra soften in ways I hadn't thought possible. She laughed more. She touched Magnus' hair gently when she thought I wasn't looking. She asked him about his studies and his friends and listened, really listened to his answers. It wasn't always smooth. There were moments when her old imperious nature would surface, when she'd start to criticize something and I'd have to give her a sharp look to remind her of her promise. But she'd catch herself, apologize, and try again. Sven noticed the change too. He came to dinner one evening and found Thyra already there, helping Magnus with his arithmetic while I finished cooking. "Well," he said, stopping in the doorway with raised eyebrows. "This is unexpected." "Brother," Thyra acknowledged a bit stiffly. They still hadn't fully reconciled. "Uncle Sven." Magnus jumped up. "Grandmother was just showing me how to calculate compound interest. It's much more complicated than simple interest, but she says if I understand it now, I'll have an advantage in business later." "Your grandmother is right," Sven said, his expression softening as he looked at his sister. "She always was excellent with numbers. Better than I was at your age, truth be told." Thyra looked startled by the compliment, then pleased. "You were better with people," she said quietly. "Better at reading situations and knowing when to push and when to wait. That's why the business thrived under your management." It was perhaps the first genuinely kind thing I'd heard her say to him in all the years I'd known her. Sven seemed to recognize the significance too. "Perhaps we could discuss some of the upcoming contracts after dinner," he suggested. "Get your perspective on the terms the Hamburg merchants are proposing." "I'd like that," Thyra said. "I've missed being involved in the business discussions." That night marked a shift. Sven began including Thyra in business matters again, valuing her input even as he maintained Magnus as his heir. Family dinners became more regular, sometimes at my modest house, sometimes at Sven's larger residence, occasionally even at Thyra's home, though those were the hardest for me, returning to the grand house where I'd once been made to feel so small. But I went anyway. For Magnus, And also because I was learning that holding on to anger only poisoned the person carrying it. Thyra had wronged me terribly, but she was genuinely trying to make amends. That had to count for something. The real test came about 8 months after that initial reconciliation. Magnus came home from the shipping offices one afternoon with a troubled expression. "What's wrong?" asked immediately. "Some boys at the dock were saying things," he said hesitantly. "About me. About you. About how you trapped Uncle Sven into making me his heir because you wanted the family money." My blood ran cold. What boys? Who said this? They were older, maybe 15 or 16. I think their fathers work at the docks. They said everyone knows that's what happened, that you're a social climber who married above your station and then manipulated Uncle Sven when things didn't work out with Papa. I wanted to rage. I wanted to find those boys and their fathers and make them take back every word. But Magnus was watching me, waiting to see how I'd respond, what I'd tell him about who he was and where he came from. "Magnus," I said, kneeling down to his level. "There will always be people who say cruel things. People who invent stories because it makes them feel superior or important. The truth is simple. I loved your father. He loved me. We built a life together and we created you. When he died, I did what any mother would do. I protected you and raised you the best I could. Uncle Sven chose to make you his heir because he saw your father in you and wanted to honor his nephew's memory. Not because I manipulated anyone. But they said. I know what they said. And it's not true. Your father's mother, your grandmother Thyra, could tell you that I never once asked Sven for anything. He came to us. He offered this opportunity because he believed in you, Magnus. In your character and your potential. Should I tell grandmother what they said? Magnus asked. Before I could answer, a voice came from the doorway. You don't need to tell me. I heard. Thyra stood there, and her face was thunderous. She must have arrived while we were talking, must have heard everything through the open window. Who were these boys? She demanded. What were their names? Grandmother, I don't want to cause trouble. Their names, Magnus. Something in her tone made him answer. One of them was called Finn. Finn Svensson, I think. His father works as a foreman at the North Dock. Petter Svensson, Thyra said grimly. I know him. Or rather, I know of him. He's been trying to get a contract with our company for years, and Sven keeps refusing because the man cuts corners and treats his workers poorly. She looked at me. This is about business, Astrid. Petter is spreading poison through his son, hoping to damage your reputation and by extension, damage Magnus' position as Sven's heir. If Magnus is seen as illegitimate or you're seen as a schemer, it weakens the succession. What do we do? Yes. This was beyond my experience. I knew how to survive poverty and how to raise a child, but I didn't know how to fight these kinds of social battles. We fight back, Thyra said simply. With the truth and with solidarity. Magnus, tomorrow you'll go to the offices with your uncle as planned. If anyone says anything to you, you hold your head high and ignore them. Astrid, you and I are going to pay some visits. Visits? To the wives of every important merchant and business owner in Copenhagen, Thyra said. We're going to present a united front. We're going to make it absolutely clear that you are family, that Magnus is legitimate, and that anyone who suggests otherwise will answer to me personally. I stared at her. This woman who had once called me a servant, who had thrown me out and refused to acknowledge her grandson, was now prepared to go to battle for us. Why? I asked quietly. Why would you do this? Thyra met my eyes, and there was no pretense in her expression. Because I failed you once, and I will not fail you again. Because Magnus is my grandson, and no one insults my family. And because... She paused, seeming to struggle with the words. Because you have been kinder to me than I ever deserved, and I owe you more than I can ever repay. So let me do this. Let me use my reputation and my connections to protect you and Magnus the way I should have done from the beginning. Over the next week, Thyra proved as fierce an ally as she had once been an enemy. We visited every influential woman in Copenhagen's merchant society. At each house, Thyra told the same story. How grief had made her irrational after Henrik's death, how she had wronged her daughter-in-law and grandson, and how she was now working to correct that mistake. She made it clear that anyone who spoke ill of me or Magnus would be speaking ill of her, and no one wanted to cross Thyra Andersdatter. She also made a point of bringing me into conversations, deferring to my opinion on matters of household management and child-rearing, subtly elevating my status from carpenter's daughter to respected member of the family. It was a masterclass in social maneuvering, and I watched in amazement as she systematically repaired my reputation. Svend, for his part, dealt with the source more directly. He called Petter Svensson to his office and made it absolutely clear that not only would he never receive a contract from their company, but Svend would personally ensure that no other reputable shipping company in Copenhagen would work with him either if he or his son continued to spread lies about Magnus. The rumors died down within a month. Magnus reported that the boys at the docks now avoided him entirely, which suited him fine. And I found myself in the strange position of actually having friends among the merchant wives. Women who had once looked through me now invited me to tea and asked my advice on various matters. It was dizzying and strange but also gratifying. Not because of the social elevation, I'd never particularly cared about that, but because it meant Magnus could grow up without the constant shadow of illegitimacy or suspicion hanging over him. 2 years passed. Magnus turned 9, then 10. He thrived under Sven's mentorship, showing a real aptitude for business and an impressive maturity for his age. Thyra remained a constant presence in our lives, and while I would never say we were close friends, we had developed a mutual respect and even a kind of careful affection. She still sometimes said thoughtless things. She still occasionally showed flashes of that old imperious nature. But she caught herself now, apologized, and tried to do better. And that effort, more than anything, had earned my forgiveness. Then came the day that changed everything again. Svend had been feeling unwell for several weeks. Nothing dramatic, just persistent fatigue and a cough he couldn't shake. We'd all urged him to see a physician, but he'd waved off our concerns, insisting it was just age catching up with him. But when he collapsed at the shipping offices one afternoon, it became impossible to ignore. The physician's diagnosis was grave. A tumor in his chest, growing and inoperable. He had perhaps 6 months, maybe less. The news devastated all of us. Magnus wept like his heart was breaking. Svend had become the father figure he'd never had. I felt like I was losing Henrik all over again. This kind man who had saved us when we had nothing. And Thyra, proud Thyra, crumbled. "Not Svend," she kept saying. "Not my brother. He's the good one. He's the one who always did everything right." Svend faced his diagnosis with the same quiet dignity he'd shown throughout his life. He put his affairs in order, made sure all the legal documents regarding Magnus' inheritance were ironclad, and spent as much time as his failing health allowed teaching Magnus everything he could about the business. "You're young yet," he told Magnus one afternoon as they sat together in Svend's study. I was there too, ostensibly organizing papers but really just wanting to be near them. "You'll have good men to help you until you're old enough to truly take control. But I want you to remember something, Magnus. The business is important, yes. The money and the contracts and the ships. All of that matters. But what matters most is how you treat people. Your mother taught you that. She raised you to be kind and fair and honest, even when the world wasn't kind to her." He looked at me then, his eyes clear despite his illness. "You did an extraordinary job, Astrid. Henrik would be so proud of the man Magnus is becoming." "I know I am." I couldn't speak around the lump in my throat, so I just nodded, tears streaming down my face. Svend lasted 4 months. He died on a cold January morning with Thyra, Magnus, and me at his bedside. His last words were, "Take care of each other. Your family." The funeral was enormous. It seemed like all of Copenhagen turned out to honor him. Speech after speech praised his integrity, his generosity, his fairness in business dealings. Magnus sat between Thyra and me, stoic and red-eyed, trying so hard to be brave. After the funeral, the reading of the will confirmed what we already knew. Magnus was Sven's primary heir. But there were surprises too. Sven had left generous bequests to his employees and their families, scholarships for sailors' children to learn accounting and navigation, and a substantial sum to my parents, ensuring their comfort for the rest of their lives. "He never forgot where you came from," Thyra said quietly as we left the solicitor's office. "Or that Magnus is your son as much as he was Henrik's. Sven wanted to make sure your whole family was provided for." The transition was not easy. Magnus was only 10, far too young to actively manage a shipping business. Sven had appointed 3 trustees, respected business associates, to oversee operations until Magnus came of age. Thyra and I were also named as advisors, to be consulted on major decisions. It meant I had to learn things I'd never imagined needing to know: profit margins and shipping routes, contract negotiations and port fees, insurance policies and customs regulations. Thyra helped, sharing her own knowledge accumulated over decades as Sven's sister and Henrik's mother. We spent hours going over ledgers and correspondence, making sure Magnus' interests were protected. And Magnus himself rose to the occasion in ways that astonished me. He attended every trustee meeting, asked intelligent questions, and studied every aspect of the business with fierce determination. He was still a child. He still played with friends and got dirty and needed to be reminded to wash behind his ears, but there was a new seriousness to him, a sense of responsibility that aged him beyond his years. "I won't let Uncle Sven down," he told me one night as I tucked him into bed. "I'm going to make him proud. I'm going to make Papa proud too. And you, Mama. I'm going to prove that you didn't struggle all those years for nothing." "Oh, my darling boy," I said, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. "You've already made me prouder than you could possibly know. You don't have to prove anything to anyone. Just be who you are, that's more than enough." Years passed. Magnus grew from a serious boy into a capable young man. By 16, he was attending business meetings without the trustees, holding his own in negotiations with men 3 times his age. By 18, he'd earned enough respect that the trustees began to step back, letting him take more control. Thyra and I both aged too. Her hair went fully white, and she moved a bit more slowly. I found silver threads in my own dark hair, and noticed that my hands looked more and more like my mother's had. But we were both still healthy, still active in Magnus' life and business. Our relationship had evolved into something I never could have imagined during those dark days after Henrik's death. We weren't exactly friends. There was too much history for that easy intimacy. But we were family in the truest sense. We worked together for Magnus' benefit, advised him together, celebrated his successes together. Sometimes late at night, I'd think back to that wedding where she'd called me a servant. How that moment of cruelty had felt like the end of everything. But it had actually been a beginning, the catalyst that brought Sven into our lives, that eventually brought Thyra herself back into our orbit as a changed woman. Magnus married at 22, to a bright young woman named Inga who worked in her father's textile business. Their wedding was everything mine, and Henrik's had been but bigger, grander, and filled with genuine joy. Thyra and I sat together at the family table, watching Magnus and Inga dance their first dance as husband and wife. "He looks like Henrik," Thyra said softly. "So much like Henrik on his wedding day." "He does," I agreed. "But he has his own strength, his own character. He's not just a copy of his father. He's himself." "Thanks to you," Thyra said, and when I looked at her in surprise, I saw tears in her eyes. "You raised him right, Astrid. Despite everything I did to hurt you, despite all the hardship, you raised a good man. A man with integrity and compassion. That's your doing. And yours in the end," I said truthfully. "These last 10 years, you've been a real grandmother to him. You've taught him, guided him, loved him. He needed that." We sat in silence for a moment, watching the celebration around us. "Do you think they forgive us?" Thyra asked quietly. "Henrik and Sven. For all the time we wasted, all the pain we caused each other." I thought about it seriously. I think they'd be glad we found our way back to each other. That we became family in truth, not just in name. I'm sorry, Thyra said suddenly, turning to face me fully. I've said it before, I know, but I want to say it again. I'm sorry for calling you a servant at Lars's wedding. I'm sorry for all the cruelty, all the dismissiveness, all the years of hardship I caused you and Magnus. I can't take any of it back, but I need you to know that I see it clearly now. What I did. What I almost destroyed. I know, I said simply. And I forgive you. I forgave you years ago, Thyra. We can't change the past, but we changed the future. That has to be enough. She nodded, wiping her eyes. It is enough. More than enough. Magnus had a daughter 2 years later, naming her Bert after my mother, who had passed peacefully in her sleep the previous winter. Then a son, Henrik, named for his grandfather. Both children called Thyra Old Moor, great-grandmother, and she doted on them with a tenderness she'd never shown to anyone before. I watched her with those babies and saw a woman completely transformed from the one who had thrown me out 20 years earlier. She sang to them, told them stories, let them climb on her despite her aching joints. She was the grandmother she should have been to Magnus, getting a second chance with his children. Now, as I sit here in my comfortable home, bought with money from Magnus' inheritance, managed carefully over the years, I'm 54 years old. My son runs a successful shipping business that employs dozens of families. My grandchildren are healthy and loved. And the woman who once called me a servant sits with me most afternoons, sharing tea and watching those same grandchildren play in the garden. Life is strange and unpredictable. Cruelty can turn to kindness. Enemies can become family. The worst moments can lead to the best outcomes, if we're brave enough to keep moving forward, to forgive when forgiveness is earned, and to build something new from the ruins of what was broken. I think about that night at the wedding often, the humiliation, the rage, the certainty that I had lost everything that mattered. If someone had told me then that 20 years later I'd be sitting peacefully with Thyra, watching our mutual grandchildren play, I would have called them mad. But here we are. Family, in all its complicated, hard-won, precious reality. And whenever Magnus introduces me at business functions or social gatherings, he never fails to say, "This is my mother, Astrid. She's the strongest person I know, and everything I am, I owe to her. Not servant. Not carpenter's daughter. Not the woman who married above her station. Just mother. And that's worth more than all the shipping contracts and properties and social standing in the world." If this story touched you, if you've ever been looked down on or dismissed, if you've ever had to fight for dignity and recognition, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. What city in this world has the honor of housing someone as strong as you? Because that's what we are. Survivors, fighters, people who know that our worth isn't determined by what others think of us. Hit that subscribe button if you believe that dignity always finds its way back to those who deserve it. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, you are not what your worst moment made you feel. You are what you